Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to a special session of the Ummatics Colloquium, organized at very short notice on the issue of Palestine. We've all been very well aware of the last 2 weeks of the things that have been happening, and we wanted to engage the topic. Ummatics is, of course, a think tank, an intellectual body, and we believe that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. But at the same time, this is such an exigent issue. We need to also have some reflection, some intellectual reflection, and also some expert insight into the area of Palestine. Palestine, of course, is a central cause for any Ummatic initiative. The Ummatics Colloquium is concerned with the realization of Muslim political agency in the spirit of the Quran and the Sunnah. And it is seeking to realize this in a context in which that agency has been systematically stripped from the Ummah over the course of the colonial period in particular. Last week, we discussed the question of media playing a role in forming and preventing the cultivation of Ummatic sentiment within Muslims worldwide. Muslims seem to be on the receiving end of constant Islamophobic attacks, and in some instances, these attacks become actual colonial sort of attacks, as we have been witnessing in recent weeks in the Holy Land. In that context, I just want to highlight and actually begin by thanking our guests who have been very kind to join us at extremely short notice. Some of you have very limited time, I understand, and so I understand that Ramzy Baroud from the US will be having to leave in half an hour, so I will open the floor to you in just a moment. But more generally, I want to briefly introduce all three of our guests who have been intimately involved in this cause, in many cases from the beginning of their actual lives. Ramzy, I'm not sure if you are Palestinian. You'll forgive me if I make that mistake, but you are Ghazawi. So,
Well, yeah, you can't be Ghazawi unless you're Palestinian, of course.
right. And so you are, Ramzy hails from Gaza. Layla Al-Aryan is a producer, an award-winning producer at Al Jazeera English in the Washington, D.C. office. Ramzy, I believe you were actually a very senior manager at Al Jazeera for several years. And Sami Hamdi is a commentator based in the UK and also a political risk analyst. Layla, your heritage, of course, goes back to the Palestinian territories as well, and you've written about the colonial incursions of the United States in the Muslim world. And Sami also sort of hails from a post-colonial sort of state, but from North Africa rather than from Gaza, but has been a very powerful voice in recent days on the Palestinian cause. So with that brief introduction, I would like to welcome you, Ramzy, to, in a sense, share your reflections on the current realities that we live within, the historical context within which that arises, and what you see as an Ummatic sort of horizon for the Muslim Ummah in the context of what we're dealing with at this point in time. The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, guys, for organizing this. And my sincere apologies for being unable to participate and listen. I'm very keen to listen to what Sami and Layla have to say. I have immense respect for them. But inshallah, maybe later on I can get back to the recording and listen to that and reflect on what they have to say. I lived in many parts of the Muslim world, um, and I traveled through many parts of it. So I am originally from Palestine, from Gaza in particular. My first venture out of Palestine was to Egypt, then Jordan, Iraq, and many other Arab countries. Then beyond that to Muslim countries as well. And then to countries where you have Muslim minorities, whether in South America, in South Africa, even New Zealand and Australia, and of course in East Asia. And I kind of developed a sense of how the everyday Muslim perceives Palestine, and it really is quite fascinating, the kind of the spiritual frame of reference, the intellectual background from which they approach Palestine. I remember being in a town called Bintulu, somewhere in East Malaysia, in the Borneo island. And I attended a wedding somewhere in this very small, far away town, even from Malaysian capital, kind of the center of Malaysian society. And they were singing Islamic songs during a wedding, and it was really fascinating experience. And then someone asked me, he said, "You don't look like you're from here." I said, "Yeah, I am from Palestine." And then he went on to, "Oh, mashallah, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa is so close to our heart." And then he said something that I didn't know how to feel about it at the time. He said, he said, "But don't worry, brother. Everything is going to be okay. It is written in the Quran." And then they carried on singing and dancing and celebrating. Um, and that very quick interaction where Palestine was spared that few seconds, but at the same time, and it's not big enough or important enough to take away from the celebration and the joy. But on the other hand, there was that certainty in his voice that everything is going to ultimately be okay because God said so in the Quran. I experienced that moment numerous times, whether in Asia, whether in Africa, in other parts of the world. You don't experience it in the Arab world so much, though. So that kind of, with time, I began learning that there are two perceptions of Palestine among Muslims. There are the faraway Muslims who haven't really been part of that collective struggle and collective experience. And they see Palestine through Islamic prism, through Islamic frame of reference, but mixed with Arab frame of reference, mixed with anti-colonial frame of reference, mixed with collective experience frame of reference. And that, in my opinion, is a fundamental difference. In a recent trip to South Africa, and I've been to South Africa several times, and every time there is always a special event or two or three dedicated to the Muslim community there, because they are quite fundamental in shaping the pro-Palestine activities and politics and lobbying at the government and various parts of civil society. And I've always argued, as I have in the last time, that you have to understand that Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, Al-Aqsa Mosque, is part of something bigger. That when we Palestinians say Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, we're not talking about walls. We're not talking about the facilities and the flowers and the museum and the gardens. We are talking about something that is part of a larger space, and that is Palestine. And I reference one of the, now, Palestine, the Holy Land in particular, Al-Aqsa Mosque, has been mentioned according to masjidalaqsa.net, which is a very interesting and important website to visit. They talk about it being mentioned 70 times. But it doesn't just mention Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. It mentions, like, for example, glorified is he who carried his servant by night from the holy Masjidain, the holy mosques, the two mosques, Mecca, to the furthest masjid in Jerusalem, whose surroundings we have blessed. Surroundings, what surroundings of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa is not just Al-Quds, but Palestine. And that's the understanding in the minds of Palestinians and the minds of those who truly understand what's happening in Palestine within truly grounded spiritual framework, but also historical framework. And this is why Muslims are attached to Palestine. They're attached to it because of that fundamental spiritual and intellectual framework that is there. You can't play around with that. You can't change it. You can't reverse it. You can't ignore it or marginalize it. It's absolutely fundamental. But how do they interact how do they determine their relationship and their sense of responsibility and obligations toward it differs from one place to the other, depending on the proximity. What are the proximities within us? What are these proximities that shared colonial, anti-colonial experience? Now there are two types of colonial experiences that matters to Arabs, Muslims, and Middle Easterns throughout the years. You have the Crusades. I believe it was in the first one was 1095, declared in southern France, where they namely go after the Muslims. Let's recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. And recapture here is quite an interesting issue, because there is always that assumption that it belonged to someone else other than the people who are living there. All the way until 1229, I believe. That has created, I mean, we are talking about hundreds of years of conflict, negative interactions, massacres, killings, destruction. That has created this collective realization among Muslims worldwide that they are under threat from some other entity coming from far, far away, and their aim is to conquer the Middle East. And that symbolic conquering of the Middle East is the Holy Land, and particularly the holy shrines in Jerusalem. That's where I feel some people deviate, and that's, I feel, where the confusion is. The crusade was done for pure geopolitical reasons, for economic interests, for trade routes, for all the reasons that colonialism took place many years later or hundreds of years later. But then the emphasis quite often is placed on the Al-Aqsa, on the Holy Land, for its pure holiness, which is not exactly the case. But at least that created that collective historical memory, experience, that many generations ago, Muslims felt that they collectively experienced throughout that region. Then you have colonialism of the 20th of the 19th century, the early 19th century, starting in North Africa, then Yemen, Aden or Aden at the time, and so forth. And then you have this, if there was any attempt in that collective Muslim mind, if you will, to overcome that historical trajectory of violence and perhaps to recreate that history based on what we hear quite often about that sense of community and cooperation that existed between Muslims, Christians, and Jews for hundreds of years in Al-Andalus, in Andalusia, in the Iberian Peninsula. That has been cancelled out, dismissed. We are re-entering the age of the Crusades. The terminologies that were used during the anti-colonial struggle, at least initially until the rise of the Arab nationalist movement, late 19th century, but particularly early 20th century, was very similar to the language used by anti-crusade resistance that happened in the Holy Land, in Palestine, and throughout the Middle East. Those who led the fight against Napoleon as he entered Egypt, where Islam was the Azhar, was the mosque, were Muslim entities, were Muslim students, were Muslim councils, were Muslim judges, were Muslims, everything. During that time, I mean, if colonialism, for example, targeted Egypt and left everybody else, targeted Algeria and ignored the rest, maybe that would have been somehow incorporated into something pertaining to Algeria as an entity, or Egypt as a geographic, political, or geostrategic entity, but that did not happen. The Crusaders went after the Middle East, Muslim nations, along with a language that was quite racist, was quite alienating, it was very clear in their mind that the issue was concerning what they called Muhammadans. That was the perception. The same way that Israelis are using the language of the Arabs or the Muslims. Arabs are this, Muslims are that. Rarely do Israelis, and notice that, use the word Palestinians. When they do use the word Palestinians, they will say Palestinian terrorists, Palestinian blank, something negative, always negative. Never our Palestinian friends, our Palestinian brothers, our Palestinian neighbors. That doesn't exist in the lexicon of Israel. And the same thing happened with the discourse that accompanied colonialism starting in the early 19th century, that was brought by Western governments, Western militaries, and Western colonial entities. Edward Said speaks about this at length in his seminal book, Orientalism, about the language and the use of the language and the discourse to kind of prepare and to streamline the kind of violence, the kind of marginalization, the kind of abuse, the kind of exploitation that accompanied colonialism. So once more, Islam is recentered in terms of the resistance to all of this. Notice how during times, and please guys, do let me know when my time ends. Whenever
go on for another 5 minutes, 5-7 minutes, if that's right.
Okay, excellent. Notice whenever there is someone is trying to push for a peace agenda, for example, at once upon a time, there was a group of Palestinians, unfortunately, they were absolutely wrong about this, that they believed that Israel was opting for peace. That led to the Oslo Accords and a whole different question that I don't want to enter to. They began emphasizing the Quranic verses that accentuates that if they, thus the enemy, opt for peace, you shall opt for peace as well. And the historical experiences, particularly the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, Andalusia, Spain, as in, you know what, we've done it before. We coexisted. And then when the Israelis violates all of these rules, invade, kill, and ruin any chances for peace, these verses and that historical experience is usually replaced by different historical experiences, particularly during the times of Prophet Muhammad, particularly the Battle of Khaybar against a particular Jewish tribe that lived there, and again, the emphasis on the other verses that speaks about the Holy Land, Al-Aqsa, the Crusades, and all this. Or not the Crusades, but rather the prophecies concerning the Crusades. And that's another thing, and maybe one of the other speakers can discuss this, that we do believe, in fact, that there are verses in the Quran that says that you shall enter the mosque as you have entered it the first time. At that time, there was no historical experiences. When did we enter it the first time? That did not happen yet. When it happened, that once again recentered the references in the Quran back at Al-Aqsa Mosque, back at the Holy Land, and back at the collective Muslim conscience. I always argue that even though Muslims approach the struggle in Palestine from spiritual background, theological background, then historical background, as in a shared struggle against colonialism and against crusades prior to that, and the fact that they are part of the region, and the fact that every reference made by the Israeli military, by the Israeli army, emphasizes what they have already believed. So the fact that all of these mosques are being destroyed, they are scratching their heads like, why? Why mosques? But they know in their mind, they know that the bombing of dozens of mosques in every war, and even mosques that is being used as sanctuary for displaced Palestinian civilians, it's all part of a program. They know that. So it accentuates the existing beliefs that have already been there, proven to be true time and time again. But still, I argue that for Muslims, this is not a holy war. And I think this is really worth emphasis here. when Israel and Israeli leaders, like for example, Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, when he went to Fox News about 8-9 days ago, and he said, this is a holy war, reiterating what the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right minister in Israel, and others, the head of the police in Jerusalem and all of this, when they emphasize this is a holy war, we are approaching a holy war. Palestinians don't declare holy war. So if they don't declare holy wars, in fact, Hamas made it very clear. They issued a statement in which, interestingly enough, you would think Hamas is a religious fundamentalist movement. They should be issuing a declaration of holy war. They don't. They actually warned against the holy war. So they perceive holy war as something that is imposed on them. Again, history is repeating itself 1,000 years ago and today. History is repeating itself. Holy war is imposed, is not fought. But that doesn't mean that Islam and Christianity, we've seen the bombing of Christian churches and hospitals in Gaza, utilize religion and spirituality and faith in their struggle as something to mobilize, to fight back, to live for, and so forth. It's an element of strength. Now, those who are unaware of the nuances of the language used by both sides will think, well, Hamas is the Islamic resistance organization or the Islamic jihad or the references to Al-Aqsa flood and all of these things. You would think that Muslims, Palestinians are declaring holy war against the Jews, but that's not the case at all. Whenever any country, any colonial power attacks and colonizes another nation, whether in Africa, South America, anywhere in the world, if you study the discourse of the attacked nation, of the usurped nation, of the exploited nation, you're going to find that they always tap to their own historical trajectory, their own discourse that gives them strength, gives them the power of community to mobilize and fight back, whether it's the Christian theology being used by various armed groups and revolutionary groups in South America, to the utilization of local religions and historical frameworks in Africa, all the way to Asia, and of course the Middle East. So in the Middle East, in other words, Islam does not see itself as an aggressor against others, but Islam is, or Muslims utilize Islam as a way to fight back. And I think, in my mind, this is an absolutely fundamental difference that has to be taken into account. I'm going to stop here because I think I've reached my limit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramzy. Really sort of insightful reflections on, starting with the sort of recognition of a global solidarity for Muslims, but on this issue, Surat Isra, Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi laylan min al-masjid al-harami ila al-masjid al-aqsa. So the reference to the Quran, and of course it's mentioned numerous times in the Quran, but then it's also mentioned numerous times in Hadith, and its sanctity is recognized within the tradition very with great sort of this is the third holiest site, and the connections with Umar radiallahu anhu and all the rest of it. And yet it's been this center for global Muslim solidarity has of course been a multicultural, multi-religious center for the duration of Islamic history. And so in that sort of context, when we come to the imposition of this Zionist project in the colonial period, Islamic solidarity is one of the major sources of global unity on these sorts of issues, and it needs to be cultivated in that way. But I found particularly interesting your comment that this is not a holy war for Muslims, because in some respects, by appropriating the language of today, we're saying this isn't a holy war, this is a war of justice, it's a just war. We actually are trying to seek justice for all participants in this, and there are aggressors and they need to be defended against. And so I think the key point that I would take away in this particular discussion of ummatics is that Islamic solidarity actually has a great potency to this day. There are comments, and I wish to welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to keep on writing them. We will address them. Unfortunately, Dr. Ramzy will not be available to answer those, but inshallah our other esteemed panelists will. But you can see the solidarity in the questions that are being asked. And perhaps briefly, Dr. Ramzy, before you have to head off, I can put to you kind of two questions. One is drawn from one of the participants who's saying, what can the diaspora do to help? And I use this term diaspora in the sense that you kind of suggested at the beginning, where you were talking about how the Malaysians perceive this as somewhat differently to, so I would consider that part of the global Muslim diaspora almost, even though it's a Muslim majority context. And the other question is, what do you think the future holds? What does Islamic solidarity add to this equation, and how could it be transformative for the future? Bismillah.
Absolutely. And I will try to address them briefly. And thank you very much for your comments and for your understanding about having to leave early. Quite often I find myself engaged in conversations with other Palestinians who feel that when Muslims show solidarity with Palestine as Muslims and based on their own frame of reference, they are confusing the issue. They are feeding into Israel's propaganda that this is about religion, and it's not. And therefore, we should shed all references and adopt just a pure secular reference. And I hate to say this, but I think that is kind of colonial thinking. That's how the West wants to perceive things, and by us adopting that sort of thinking, we are losing the ability to tap into an incredible reservoir of solidarity that exists within the Ummah. I think there is a difference between Muslims, whether in diaspora or in the Middle East or in Palestine itself. There's a difference between Muslims taking complete ownership and say, this doesn't concern about anybody, it's a Muslim thing. That's a big mistake. But when Muslims join a larger global solidarity movement as Muslims, based on their own frame of reference of being Muslims and what does that actually mean and what kind of action it compels, but understanding that Palestine and solidarity with Palestine has to be, by definition, global solidarity, then I think they need that. They need that Muslim thing, that Muslim frame of reference. So it's all about how to navigate the relationship. Yes, if you abandon the concept of justice that exists in Islam, what's the point? Where Islam, the word adl or adala, just or justice in Islam, are absolutely fundamental. I've heard a Muslim scholar a while back saying, if Islam can be reduced to a single word, and it shouldn't, it's going to be justice. How do I neglect all of this? Select all, delete, and move on and go and find some other frame of reference coming from Europe or Canada? It doesn't work that way. No, tap into that energy, that collective energy and history and spirituality, but do not marginalize yourself. Lead the movement, but be part of that movement and don't take ownership. And remember, this is not just about Al-Aqsa Mosque, but Al-Aqsa Mosque and its surroundings. It's about Palestine and it's about justice, whether in Palestine or outside of Palestine. What does the future hold? I think the future is for Palestine. And it's not because I have these illusions or hopes, but think about it this way. We are a people who have never lost our connection to our land. We have never lost sight of where we came from. We are talking about 75 years of Zionist colonialism. We are talking about 100 years of Western colonialism. And we are talking about a historical trajectory that goes back hundreds of years. In our collective minds, and I hate the word collective minds, but just to make the point, I feel like we are clear about all of this. And it's that clarity and the tenacity of the Palestinian people, the tenacity of the Palestinian people that will make, with the solidarity and help and support and love coming from throughout the Muslim world, throughout the world, I think Palestine and the Palestinian people will eventually be free, and perhaps sooner than we expected. I saw a niqabi woman, a woman who's completely covered in Gaza. She was on Al Mayadeen, a news station in Lebanon yesterday. She was speaking from Gaza, and she was completely covered, and that should automatically means that she's passive, she's irrelevant, she's unimportant, she's not a political actor. And at the bottom, she says she is the grandmother of a child who was just killed by Israel. She was speaking from the hospital. And she goes, we are 2.3 million people. If they kill 2 millions, the remainder will liberate Gaza, will liberate Palestine. It is that tenacity that and I'm talking in terms of anti-colonial struggle. There is not a single nation anywhere in the world that fought against colonialism with that kind of tenacity and ever lost. It's not going to happen in Palestine, and Palestine will not be the exception.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Ramzy. This has really been a wonderful and illuminating sort of series of reflections. We're sorry that we're not going to be able to have you for the next hour and a half, but I am also very grateful to our other two esteemed panelists for their sort of joining in, and they're going to be with us now for the remainder of this session. So I thank you again, Dr. Ramzy, and inshallah,
thank you.
What you say will ultimately come to pass, what you sort of foresee in our future, inshallah. So with that, I would like to now invite Layla Al-Arian, an multiple award-winning journalist from Al Jazeera in Washington, D.C., and someone who has been sort of involved in the reflecting on questions of Palestine, including, I think, in some of your writing. Your book was on Iraq, as far as I understand, co-written with Chris Hedges. But of course, a lot of your work has overlapped considerably. And perhaps you can bring us a sort of a global journalist's perspective to the questions of Ummatic solidarity in the context of Palestine. The floor is yours for the next 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. I believe it's a testament to the solidarity that we see across the Muslim world and across the non-Muslim world as well. We all saw the massive rallies that have taken place around the world, from France, where they actually banned rallies, to London yesterday, where over 100,000 people gathered, to New York, to Washington, to Yemen. We all saw those extraordinary pictures, to Iraq, to Egypt, where they marched on Tahrir Square to show just how extraordinary the solidarity with the Palestinian people is in the face of a global media led by the Western media that has been incredibly hostile, incredibly inaccurate, sensationalist, and biased towards Israel. So you see this solidarity, and I think that's what scares Israel so much, that despite the millions of dollars they're putting into YouTube ads, into cultivating Western journalists, and having them essentially act as stenographers for them, you still see tremendous solidarity. And that's also a testament to the just nature of our cause. So I wanted to start out by describing a video that I watched on Thursday morning that truly broke me. And I think all of us here, and just the impressive turnout we see here of all the people who attended, shows that people really care. And I think people are seeing the same photos and videos that I'm seeing. And so on Thursday morning, I saw a video of two boys in Gaza, and one of them, very young, one of them was the older brother, and as his younger brother was dying, he was asking him to say the Shahada. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. All of us imagine that moment when we're going to take our last breaths on this earth. And to see two young children going through that moment, and one older brother talking his brother through it is absolutely heartbreaking. And I ask myself, am I the only person seeing these videos and these photos? Because the callousness by which our politicians, our journalists here in the West are responding to the killings of Palestinians in Gaza, including 1,800 children, shows me that they're either not seeing these videos or they're seeing them and they simply don't care. Simply put, our lives don't matter. So the next day, I was in Congress and I saw a member of Congress, and I went up to him with all of these videos and photos and the humanitarian catastrophe happening in Gaza in mind. And I said, Congressman, will you support Representative Cori Bush's bill calling for a ceasefire in Gaza? People are dying, our families are dying. My mother herself lost 11 members of her extended family, including a 2-month-old baby. And he responded again with the callousness that I just described and said, well, they've been fighting each other for thousands of years. This is what we're dealing with in terms of the politicians that are making the decisions to send increased weapons to Israel, increased aid to Israel, not even knowing the very basic history of what we're dealing with, thousands of years. This is, of course, a very insidious myth that has been pushed by Zionists for years to muddy the waters about what this issue is actually about. And as Dr. Baroud very eloquently described, this is a settler colonial struggle. What I told the congressman is, no, sir, this is settler colonialism. It's the longest modern occupation of our time. It's been going on for 75 years. My grandparents were affected. My grandparents were forcibly removed from their land. And he repeated, they've been fighting for thousands of years, and walked off. Before actually saying, well, we have to fight Hamas, I said, sir, before Hamas, there were other groups. And even if you completely eliminate Hamas, there will be other groups. This is about settler colonialism. It's about Palestinians, fighting for self-determination and, for the people who were forcibly, ethnically cleansed from their land. And of course, what we see now is an ongoing genocide in addition to the ethnic cleansing. So the question of Palestine is so fraught with conflicting narratives, which is that before we even talk about what it is, we need to talk about what it isn't. It's not a conflict between religious faith communities, as Dr. Baroud told us, that goes back thousands of years, as this congressman believes. It's not the Zionist myth that it's a land without a people for a people without a land. Obviously, we know that there were people there, including my grandparents. We know that when Israel was established in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their land, including my grandparents. And we know that that number has swelled to millions that now live, many of whom in the diaspora and refugee camps, or they live in Arab countries where they're treated as second-class citizens. I've been reading a book by the scholar Khalid Abul Fadl, The Prophet's Pulpit. And in it, he talks about how modern Muslims seem to think that you can love God, but be neutral about God's creation, or indifferent as to who suffers, who lives, and who dies. And he says, the reason I care so much about human rights is because I am Muslim. And he says that human rights is the expression in the modern world to describe the worth and dignity of human beings. And this is why all of us should care. Even if Al-Quds wasn't our first, Al-Aqsa, Masjid Al-Aqsa was not our first Qibla, even if there wasn't this long connection between our faith and Jerusalem, we should care because this is a human rights issue, and because our governments, especially for those of us living in the West, are the enabler of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It is our tax dollars that goes towards funding ethnic cleansing and genocide. And for that, it is incumbent on us to speak out, otherwise we are complicit. He also says you can't pretend to be a good Muslim in this day and age if you don't respect human rights. And this is a question that I challenge the audience to think about, because we have scholars within our own communities. We have global Muslim celebrity scholars who are also complicit in what's happening in terms of giving cover to countries that have normalized with Israel, being paid by them, being mouthpieces for them, and who are supporting these efforts to normalize with Israel, both in terms of the Gulf countries that have already done so, but on a more local level, we have faith washing programs, including here in the United States. There was a program called the Muslim Leadership Initiative that began in 2013 that sought to undermine the nonviolent, peaceful boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement by taking handpicked groups of so-called Muslim American leaders to Israel to then brainwash them into supporting the Zionist narrative and undermining, like I said, support for the nonviolent BDS movement. And when some of us in the American Muslim community spoke out against this program, we were viciously attacked and told that we don't want peace, and told that You have to normalize with Zionists. We have to work with them in order to advance other issues. Now, of course, we see this also comes up during elections, right? So we have groups that purport to speak for the larger Muslim American community that say, listen, Palestine has been this thorn in our back. It's been this really pesky issue that we need to just set aside in order to work with politicians in order to achieve, to make progress on other issues. Well, we now see that in the face of the slaughter of children, the bombing of mosques in Gaza, of hospitals, of civilian buildings, and a complete inability of these same Muslims who say, just give us a chance. We need to be at the table, otherwise we're on the menu, to even have their voices heard. So we know that if you put Palestine on the chopping block, that everything else goes with it. And that we as a community must have red lines, and those red lines must begin and end with Palestine. So where are we now? Well, we're in the midst of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We know that food and water and fuel have all been cut off from the people of Gaza, who are being bombarded daily from the air. We know that more than 4,000 people have been killed, including 1,800 children. And we know that there's, in the face of all of this, we have deeply problematic media coverage of this. So if you were to watch Western media, you would have no idea what's actually happening. You would hear very little about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and instead watch wall-to-wall coverage of Israeli hostages and their families, and also be subject to completely sensationalist and unverified stories about beheaded babies, about rapes that have no basis in reality, and then are then repeated and echoed by the President of the United States. Let's look at this hospital bombing, Al-Ahli hospital bombing that happened this week. So Palestinians have said that it was Israel that bombed it, and that no Palestinian group even has the capacity to of a weapon that would cause that kind of destruction. Initially, the media went with Palestinians say that Israel attacked the hospital and hundreds of people were killed, and you immediately see the Israeli spin machine in action. Once they realize, of course, we know that an aide to Benjamin Netanyahu tweeted right away that Israel attacked the hospital and that the hospital had been warned to leave and that it was a Hamas target. And then you see, as soon as the negative feedback starts, because it's a hospital and of course it's a war crime, among many other war crimes that have already occurred in this latest invasion of Gaza, including the use of white phosphorus against civilians. You see an immediate spin machine, sort of take hold, and the media repeating unverified claims by Israel that in fact it was a Palestinian rocket, despite no forensic evidence proving that. And of course, that being repeated by, the U.S. intelligence services as well as the president himself. So what you see in terms of the media coverage is, as I mentioned earlier, sort of resorting to stenography, not reporting stories out themselves, using words when it comes to reporting on Palestinian violence, like brutal, horrific, inhumane, gruesome, etc., slaughter, while not using the same terms when it comes to Israeli violence, right? So when they discuss Israeli violence, it's always in the most clinical, detached terms. And then there's, of course, a complete lack of context about where any of this came from. So if you were to watch or listen to Western media, everything began on October 7th with the Hamas attack against Israel. Before that, of course, we know that the killing of Palestinians never stopped. The land confiscations never stopped. The imprisonment of Palestinians, including children, including in administrative detention where they don't even face any charges, they're just held indefinitely. Settler expansion, home demolitions, which is a form of collective punishment, to say nothing of the 17-year siege of Gaza, which itself is a humanitarian crisis. None of that is covered in the Western media as the ongoing violence that Israel inflicts on the Palestinian people, the ongoing humanitarian crisis, as well as, of course, a system of apartheid that even Western human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have identified as a violation of international law. the fact that Palestinians live under a completely different system than Israelis when it comes to everything from courts to even the roads that they could drive on, the access to water, and of course, the Palestinians living in this completely militarized way in which their freedom of movement is completely controlled. I traveled to Palestine this summer for the first time in 25 years, and every time we would travel through the West Bank, all we would hear from our guides is, and then the settlers came and took this land, and then the settlers came and took that land. They're operating with absolute impunity. And as I mentioned before, this is not just incumbent upon us to be active to inform ourselves about because it's an issue that's connected to us as Muslims, because Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem are so important to us, but also because of the complicity of our own governments and our own tax dollars. But also we should look at this as a domestic issue, right? So part of the reason that our governments are so pro-Israel is because of the power and influence of the pro-Israel community in the United States and how that figures. And it's not until our own community kind of organizes on these issues, unites, and makes our voices heard that we're going to have any semblance of influence as well. As far as what we can do now, I know this is something that's on the minds of a lot of people because we feel such tremendous helplessness in the face of the tragedies that we see on our smartphones, on our social media. One thing I would say is please don't shield yourself. I know that it can be very difficult to continue following this, but the absolute least we can do is to continue informing ourselves of what's happening, considering the people on the ground and what they're dealing with and the tremendous trauma that they're enduring. When I hear and see that children are losing their entire family members, all it makes you think is how do they get through this? At the same time, you see the tremendous faith that the people in Gaza have. And all I keep thinking about is that's what keeps them going. And the absolute least we can do is to keep educating ourselves. Also, I think a lot of people feel very intimidated about speaking out, but please keep in mind, this is not complicated. This is the longest modern occupation, modern history. This is settler colonialism, and this is apartheid. And if mainstream human rights organizations can say that, so can we.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for really some brilliant insights coming from someone who's really on the ground and has been for so long, but you're actually speaking to Congress people like right now. And so that this is one of the ways in which Al Jazeera is an extremely important sort of media institution, but also the sort of work that Glenn Greenwald believes in, a certain advocacy journalism, you could say, or the fact that journalism needs to be in this way very driven by values. And I think that reminds us of the importance of not just the United States, but doing this sort of work everywhere. I think when it comes to the United States, it has this outsized role, of course, in the global order. And I'm sure we'll be coming back and touching on a lot of this. I am conscious that Sidi Sami has been very patient with us for the last hour, but I'm sure we're going to hear some very insightful words from you. I think one of the ways I want you to perhaps think about your presentation, not just thinking within the framework of an ummatic paradigm, which you do already, but in the sense of how does the ummah act as a lobby vis-a-vis the global policy establishment, because the policy establishment is reinforcing these sort of norms, particularly with the backing of the United States. I'm sure you will have a lot more of insight to share with us, but please feel free now to take the floor, Sir Sami, for the next 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to everybody, and thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be alongside an esteemed panelist, Layla Al-Arian. I followed her for a few years. Her work is stellar, and it's excellent, everything that she's doing as well. And Dr. Ramzy Baroud has his videos as well that everybody knows about as well. And I think that they are very good and valiant examples of Muslims being or trying to push and influence the mainstream narrative in a way that all of us are benefiting from, and they've broken ground for us in order for us to capitalize on as well. So for that, I'm grateful for the invitation here and to be alongside them. I think that one of the things that is worth noting is that when it comes to the Ummah's approach to what's happening in Palestine, I understand the desire to separate the idea of an Islamic cause and the Palestinian cause as far as the narrative is concerned. But I think a lot of that has to do with the understanding of what Islamic actually means with regards to the reasons why an ummah would resonate with what's happening in Palestine, or the Uyghurs in China, or the Rohingya in the Myanmar. When the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam stands in the final khutbah, and he stands and he says, إن دماءكم وأموالكم وأعراضكم حرام عليكم كحرمة يومكم هذا في شهركم هذا في بلدكم هذا. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is ascertaining that everybody who believes in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, their property, blood, and honor is sacred to each other. The fact that Palestinians can be ousted from their home, driven from their land, on the basis of a people who want to establish an ethnocentric state and establish an apartheid, is something that goes against the very basic conscience, not just of every Muslim, but to every fitrah that Islam resonates with. I think the reality is that it's not necessarily about separating Islam from the Palestinian cause, but emphasizing that the reason it is Islamic is not just that Allah made Masjid al-Aqsa this third holy site, but also the fact that the Palestinians have been driven from their homes, and therefore everything that Islam stands for has been violated. And the only way that Islam can stand as a basis on which justice should be upheld, the only stance a Muslim can take is to go out and exert every effort they can to restore the property and land to the Palestinians, to restore land to the Rohingya, to restore land to every oppressed population, Muslim or non-Muslim. The Muslims stand for justice, and that's the essence. And that's why Ibn Khaldun said, Al-adlu asasul mulk. Justice is the foundation of all dominion. And al-dhulmu mu'dhinun bi kharab al-umran. Oppression is what heralds the downfall of a civilization. It's why Ibn Taymiyyah said that Allah will preserve a state that doesn't believe in him if it is just, but will destroy a Muslim state that believes in him if it is unjust. For Allah might tolerate a disbelief with justice, but will not tolerate belief with injustice. It's so synonymous with Islam that it cannot be separated. So when we're talking about why the Ummah resonates with the Palestinian cause, it's not just about Masjid al-Aqsa, but it's also about the very simplicity of the cause. There is no complexity to the Palestinian cause. Europeans gassed the Jewish population. They put them under a Holocaust. They massacred them in the Inquisition. They turfed them from Europe through violent anti-Semitism that hasn't been seen anywhere else in the world. Europe turfed the Jews and made it clear that for them they were going to continue oppressing the Jews. So the Jews came to Muslim lands. They came to the Palestinians, and they found that Islam is so rich in its heritage of coexistence, is so rich in its framework and its structure, the way that in the Quran and Sharia and Allah's law, Allah allows room for Judaism, for Jewish law and for Christian law to be practiced even within a framework for Islam. The Muslims welcomed the Jews to live next to them side by side, to build homes, to have land and the like. But the Zionist project came around and convinced some Jews, not all of them, to pick up a gun and start turfing the Palestinians. The Palestinians welcomed the Zionists into their homes on the basis that they were Jews who had been persecuted, and the Zionists turned around and turfed the Palestinians. It's not complex. It's this idea that the people have been driven from their land, driven from their homes, and therefore it is an incumbent duty on everyone, Muslim and non-Muslim. The reasons the non-Muslims resonate is not because it's Islam, it's because it violates every basic fitrah. Something in their heart screams that there's something wrong with this, and that's why they also stand with the Palestinian cause. I don't think that there's anything wrong with asserting that it's an Islamic cause or a Muslim cause, because the very essence of Islam itself is to ensure that justice reigns supreme, irrespective of who it belongs to. When Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala anhu is in a court case against a Jewish individual, and the judge rules in favor of the Jewish individual and turns around to Ali bin Abi Talib and says to him, Ya Abul Hasan, you look upset with the judgment that I've given. And Ali bin Abi Talib gets angry with the judge and says, I'm not angry with your judgment, I'm angry that you elevated me in status by calling me by kunya, Abul Hasan, but you did not elevate the Jewish on the other side, and you referred to him solely by his name. Either treat us us equally, but don't treat us unequally. In other words, Islam in its very essence is about justice, and that's why the Palestinian cause remains at the heart due to the very brazen nature in which all of the chaos unfolded. And what compounds it for the Muslim and the non-Muslim is that instead of the world coming together and saying this is very clearly a settler apartheid occupation, this is very clearly the illegal seizing of land that belongs to another dishonestly with the intention to deprive, the world instead is coming to the Palestinians and saying we have this great idea that's called the two-state solution. Layla al-Arian might not be able to get her land back. Let's give that to the Israelis and let's agree on new borders where she can build a new home somewhere else, and we'll call that the new Palestinian state. There is an attempt by the international community to legalize the illegality, to normalize the illegality, to normalize the oppression under what's called a two-state solution. When people say that Muslims oppose the right of Israel to exist, the question itself is framed wrong. It's not whether they oppose the right of Israel to exist. They oppose the right of Israel to exist at the expense of the Palestinians and on the basis of the theft of Palestinian land. If Israel wants to exist, let it do it through legal means, not through illegal means, by illegally turfing the population, massacring them, committing ethnic cleansing, committing genocide, bombing the daylights out of them in Gaza, and then telling the world that they're animals who aren't entitled to electricity and water because somehow they are the ones who are oppressing the oppressor as opposed to the oppressor oppressing the oppressed. And this is why I think that when we look at the idea of where Islam, the reason the Ummah resonates so deeply with Palestine is because of Masjid al-Aqsa. The reason they believe it's holy because the rights of the human beings have been so violated and it goes against everything of the fitrah, so they stand by it. And the reason, and to go to your question in terms of the role of the Ummah, in terms of what their mobilization and then the way that they've been able to communicate, I do think that we're seeing unprecedented times. I can't remember human rights calling Israel an apartheid in my short lifetime, or even the elders can't remember it. I can't remember Amnesty calling Israel an apartheid regime. I can't remember apartheid having been used on the Congress floor. I can't remember an article in the New York Times, which was written by Nicholas Kristof in 2021, where he argued that the relationship between the US and Israel is no longer unshakable. The reason that these narratives are changing is not because there's a top-down approach, but because the Ummah has been roaring and shouting and spreading the content and breaking the monopoly of Israel over the narrative through social media, that they've been able to finally break through and put that Palestinian content onto the homepages of non-Muslims and neutrals, that has resulted in phenomenon such as the viral video that went out of DeSantis, the Republican candidate, going into a supermarket telling them that Israel has a right to self-defense, and the American citizens respond and say, I don't believe you, I've seen with my own eyes what's happening in the Palestinians. When Ian Bremmer, one of the most prominent political analysts in the US, tweets and says, I've never seen so much disinformation on the issue of Israel and Palestine, what he means is that he's never seen so much pro-Palestinian content, because the way that the Ummah has been roaring and sharing the content on WhatsApp, Instagram, TikTok, all of this social media, sparing nothing. I echo what Layla al-Arian was saying, that keep talking about the Palestinians and the like. The way that content has been shared means that new audiences have been seeing for the first time the reality. Israel was telling them what was happening, but the Palestinians are now showing them what is happening. And this is what is causing the shift that makes 300,000 people take to the streets in London, that makes large Jewish communities go to Congress and make a sit-in to demand a ceasefire, that makes, for the first time, a YouGov poll in the UK says that more than 70% of Britons are in favor of an immediate ceasefire. When a poll comes out in the US, unprecedented, where more than 50% of Americans are in favor of an immediate ceasefire with regards to Gaza. Israel is losing the control over the narrative. It's losing its monopoly. And that's been broken first by a new Palestinian generation, fluent in English, tech savvy, able to deliver their message through the world via Instagram and the like. And then secondly, being reinforced by the Ummah, who then share it and like it and play with the algorithm, which means it goes higher on people's homepages, which then reaches the neutral neutral, the third stage, who then see it, they're shocked, they show it to their own community, and then suddenly Blinken has to sit down with his staff in the State Department to do a listening session because his staff now are furious about the position that the US is taking on Palestine. It's why he's had one of his top directors resign from the State Department. It's why the Democrats are now concerned they might lose Michigan and some of these other states as a result of their stance on Israel. All of this is because of the role that first the Palestinians have played, secondly the Ummah that heard their call and mobilized within the powers that they have, and thirdly the neutrals who for the first time are being exposed to the realities of what's happening in Palestine, and it's moving them, it's shifting their global opinion. Consider that Israel, the highest authorities, I remember in 2021 when Israel started bombing Gaza, Benny Gantz called an emergency meeting within the first 24 hours with the heads of TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. The reason he called that meeting was to try to silence the people, the ordinary people who were tweeting and promoting the posts and making the algorithm favor pro-Palestinian posts. When you look at the fake news that was spread over the beheaded babies, when you look at, for example, and I imagine, and people will see this, when this goes up on the Ummatic YouTube page, I think it is very likely that when they open the YouTube video, they'll see a pro-Israel ad that is trying to denounce the Palestinians because of the huge sums of money that they're spending on social media ads, desperately trying to recover the control of the monopoly that they've lost as a result of the efforts, first of the Palestinians who never say die, and secondly of the Ummah that have rallied on social media to amplify their voices. I saw a journalist in Gaza where she put a video out and she said that Israel have cut the electricity. My phone battery is going to die. I will no longer be able to document what's happening. Everybody, please stop talking about us. And I speak only from a personal experience. It moved me so much that I just went for the next 2 hours on Twitter and the like, finding everything on Palestine that I could retweet. In my heart, I was saying, I will not let your voice drown out. The message was so powerful. When I see Muhammad al-Kurd, for example, in Jerusalem, who puts a tweet out and says that I am, despite the despair, I am filled with hope at the global solidarity that I'm seeing. Where is he seeing it? He's seeing it on social media. In other words, just as they are giving us the encouragement to raise awareness on their behalf, we are also trying to tell them that the world stands with them, that the Ummah stands with them. And that's why I think that when you consider that the Secretary of State Blinken was supposed to go to Tel Aviv and then back to Washington to show support for Israel, and then when he lands in Tel Aviv, he decides to go and travel to Saudi Arabia and these other places. And when you read the Washington Post analysis, which says that the reason he made this last minute change was because he went to seek help to, quote, tamp down public anger, to ask for help, to keep the public, to keep those who are listening to this and those of us sitting here, to try to get us to stop talking about Palestine, because there is an unprecedented change that is taking place in public opinion. Even if perhaps the Gazans are being bombarded and it looks like Israel is winning, I actually argue that Israel is less bombing Gaza and more trying to bomb this unprecedented spirit and shift in global public opinion. It's scrambling in order to try to rescue its control over public opinion that it will never be able to restore. It will never be able to secure that control back. So to answer your question directly in terms of the role of the Ummah and what has happened in the Ummatic sentiment, but even those who are non-Muslims as well, I do think that while we credit the non-Muslims for their support in standing with Palestinians, and while we've seen growing number of allies, it's important to note that the reason the algorithm today favors pro-Palestinian content is because 1.9 billion Muslims around the world who resonate with Palestine are tweeting like crazy and sharing content like crazy and WhatsApping each other and talking to each other and going into the workplace and talking about Palestine, even if they're not equipped with the information to argue and win the debate. The fact that so many of them are talking are forcing people to say, where did all these pro-Palestinian people come from? And that's why I think that it's quite, and I'll finish on this point, I think it's very fascinating that there was a generational poll, and excuse my voice, I'm a bit tired, but there was a generational poll where it said that 65 plus are still in favor of Israel, but the lower you go in terms of the age range, the more you find that amongst 25 and younger, less than 30% support the Israeli narrative. There's a shift in public opinion. There's a change that's taking place. And I'll finish on this example in history. We may be saddened by what's happening in Palestine, and truly it breaks the heart to see the babies who are killed, to see the massacre, to see the international community so complicit in trying to throw out international law or the like. But I come from my maternal side from an Algerian background. In 1945, when France was liberated from Nazi Germany and the UN got together to write a wonderful charter that every man is born free, France celebrated in Paris, but massacred 30,000 Algerians on the same day, who took to the streets believing they were also entitled to independence and they were also entitled to freedom. They massacred 30,000 according to declassified French documents to teach them a lesson so that they would never dare take to the streets again demanding their liberation. They believed that after the 30,000 were dead, after that, the Algerians would never take to the streets. 17 years later, only 17 years later, 132 years of French occupation came to an end. It looks bleak, but I actually think that in the bigger picture, we may be looking back on what's happening in Gaza today as the turning point when global public opinion shifted, just as it shifted in the 1980s when South African apartheid could no longer be upheld and the international community could no longer in good conscience continue to support the apartheid regime in South Africa. And I promise this is the final point, one of the reasons that a ground invasion has been delayed, according to Israeli journalists themselves, is not just about this idea that maybe Iran might get involved or the like, but it's because they're concerned about the public opinion. They're concerned that if they go into Gaza, they will permanently lose the public opinion, and they're desperately trying to rectify that before they embark on a ground invasion. And that's why they've tried to turn off the lights in Gaza and to try to cut the internet in order to ensure that when they go and do their genocide, they want to make sure the world doesn't see it so that they can deny it, just as they denied their bombing of the hospital and deny everything else, all the other war crimes that they're doing. I do think that we're seeing a major shift, and that's because the Ummah has mobilized, and that's inspired allies who are non-Muslims to also mobilize as well. And I think in these dark times, that is a cause for celebration.
Thank you, Sami. As always, I mean, your passion jumps out from the screen, and we feel it. And you've mentioned so many sort of important points of reflection, whether it's in the sort of systemic structural domain, but also in terms of the importance of showing rather than telling. And this is a reminder, actually, even just as an individual Muslim, the power of one's da'wah, so to speak, in behaving in a particular way is far greater than talking about how wonderful Islam is, for example. And this is where I think the Palestinians really demonstrate the very best of humanity in these dark moments. And although the anecdotes you've mentioned, and I was just watching yesterday the case of the Palestinian doctor, and you may have seen this, whether on Channel 4, ITV had a longer piece on this, and Middle East Eye had a 2-minute piece on this. A doctor in one of the hospitals suddenly is surrounded by his family saying, "We've just been bombed, and where is Yusuf?" The 6-year-old son, they couldn't find him. And the mother is completely sort of losing it. She's completely overwhelmed and saying, "Where is Yusuf? Where is Yusuf?" And the brother is hitting his father saying, "Where's my brother? Where's my brother?" And the father is a doctor who's taking care of all of these other patients. And just the immense patience this man shows. He walks to the morgue and he has to confirm on site the mutilated body of his son under the bombing. And he looks for a moment, he covers his face, he turns around and he tells people, "Just leave me alone for a moment." And then it just takes a short moment and he says, "Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal," and he begins walking forward back to his job of saving other human beings. And then the ITV version of this shows him comforting his wife. And just the power of humanity, that these dark moments bring out just the very best of human beings. And I think Palestinians and all other people suffering in the world right now, we're witnessing just a level of carnage that, thanks to institutions like Al Jazeera, we are able to witness up close as well on a rolling basis. And thanks to the ingenuity and tenacity of the average Palestinian charging their phones using car batteries, we're able to continue to receive the regular social media updates. So I think there is great inspiration to come from this. And even in the darkness, I mean, I just want to remind people of the hadith of the Prophet, "Ajaban li amri al-mu'min fa inna amrahu kullahu khair." How wonderful is the state of the believer, because all of their states are good. If they are afflicted with something good, it actually says afflicted in the hadith. If they're afflicted with something good, then they are grateful, and that is good for them. And if they're afflicted with something bad, they are patient, and that is good for them. So I think it's important for us never to lose sight and never to lose hope. And this has been the message, I think, that has come up from all three of the panelists and the two who are present today. I want to actually open the floor. That we've had a flood of questions. This has actually been the largest Ummatics Colloquium event we've ever held. We've had as many as 250 people in attendance. And so we're very grateful for people's realizing the Ummatic spirit and realizing their solidarity with their Palestinian brothers and sisters and doing dua for them, but also actually, making it count in very real ways by educating yourselves, as Sister Layla and Brother Sami both highlighted. I wanted to perhaps direct some of the questions. Unfortunately, because of the sheer volume of questions, I don't think we can do justice to them, but I wanted to perhaps start with a question at Sami. And again, with any of these questions, and indeed the questions that you can see that we haven't specifically identified, if you want to go ahead and address it, please don't hesitate. But Sami, someone's asking a quite pointed question, and this is a question for all of us, but I think your insight on this has been powerful in recent days. He asks, or she asks, why does the public opinion matter if 1 million people can sort of demonstrate in London and not stop the Iraq war?
I understand why sometimes an individual might feel powerless in everything that is happening. What can I do? The world seems to go past me and I can't seem to do anything. But my job as a political risk consultant is often to sit with diplomats and to sit with policymakers and to discuss how things are moving in the world. And public opinion always comes up. When Blinken and Netanyahu sit in a war room and Blinken says, I need to go to the regional powers to tamp down on public anger, Blinken believes that he has to get on a plane, take his whole staff, fly from the other side of the world, go and sit with regional leaders and tell them, please, the ordinary person who's sitting on their phone and sitting on their laptop talking about Palestine, I need you to try to find me a way, give me a fatwa, find an imam, somebody to tell them that it's not worth doing. When Benny Gantz sits with the directors of TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, Benny Gantz has identified something about public opinion that is so potent and so dangerous that he has to sit with them and tell them, please limit the reach of #Palestine. Please shadow ban Instagram accounts. Please prevent these accounts from spreading. When the European Union, Israel allies in the European Union, make a document that they're trying to put to the European Commission to impose and warn social media about pro-Palestinian content, those who are sitting in the highest levels of state, those who we see as the ones who don't care about public opinion, those who are making the decisions believe that they have to take hours and hours out of their day, out of the military front, to go and sit and say to social media that the ordinary Tom, Dick, and Harry who put #Palestine in their post is so frustrating to what we want to achieve that we would like to kindly ask you, social media, to limit. The one thing that bewilders me about people who put these questions is that how is it that Benny Gantz believes that it is a potent force that needs to be contained, but the one that he's trying to contain cannot see the power that they are exerting that forces Benny Gantz to hold these meetings in the first place? Why is it that the one who poses the question and believes themselves to be irrelevant and insignificant, when Blinken is sitting with Netanyahu and saying that ordinary people who are tweeting and playing with the algorithm and promoting the content are causing a problem for us? Blinken, go and travel to these states and seek help, because I can't launch a ground offensive within this kind of environment. Why is it that when the police in London say we expect 10,000 to turn up, and then 300,000 turn up, not because of a government initiative, but because the content, the collective loud voice of the people talking about Palestine has inspired people to go and defy the push to prevent them from coming out in order to protest? Why is it when Macron bans protests because he doesn't want to import the conflict, people still take to the streets, and everybody and the French policymakers are now discussing between themselves whether it's a good idea to continue giving unconditional support to Israel because we don't want the upheaval? The person who asks this question, it's true that the trajectory of the process might be turbulent and not the way that you want it. But I'll finish on this point in order to put perspective to everything that is happening. 90 years ago, this region was under official colonization. The French were officially in Algeria. The British were officially in Egypt. The global order was underpinned by colonization. It was underpinned by this idea that freedom belongs to the civilized West, but colonization belongs to the global South and the rest of the world. The reason that global order doesn't exist today, that existed only 90 years ago, is because the people of the global South and the colonized people broke that colonization. They didn't leave willingly. Public opinion forced them out. Public opinion is a formidable force. In the Arab Spring, it toppled authoritarian regimes and the like. And that's why I want to finish on this point to emphasize. Public opinion may not bring about the result that you want, but it forces a reconsideration on the part of the policymakers to at least either at best temper the worst and at best alter the course that they're doing. And I think that's something that shouldn't be underestimated or undermined.
Thank you. I mean, I want to remind people you can actually see a wonderful discussion at Sami. It's a tour de force of a recording, but for about 25 minutes, you're talking about exactly the impact that public opinion can have and the individual Muslim can contribute. A question for you, Layla, with respect to, oh, sorry, my screen has, so, and this is a very important question, how can we humanize the Palestinian people more? So part of what's going on, and this is, of course, one of the things that institutions like Al Jazeera are so important for, and of course the on the ground people spreading on social media. But with Zionism so aggressively actually trying to dehumanize the Palestinians, and we saw this in the language that was being used, very genocidal language, really. How can we actually do something to humanize Palestinians more? In addition to that, I'll add that what will it take for us to have our versions of Schindler's List? What will it take to have our versions of those poignant stories written by great novelists of our time to start to have an impact on the people who really have the levers of power?
Thank you for those questions. So yesterday, a friend of mine was very frustrated because CBS News here in the US came to her home, spent 2.5 hours with her. She was very vulnerable, showed them family photos of her family in Gaza who are under bombardment, gave this very extensive interview. They used about 1 minute of it in an hour-long special in which they said there's a blame game between both sides, and that you just hear her say, well, the occupation, and we have to look at the occupation, and this, and it just made her sound like angry and sort of complaining and blaming, and it was completely devoid of context. And then they spent 15 minutes on the family of a hostage who turned out to be an IDF soldier, in which they said he decided to serve in the IDF in order to serve for the military of his grandparents' country. Like, imagine how the context and the history gets completely flipped on its head. So I think I mentioned earlier, we need to, I think people, if they see coverage like that, that's extremely problematic, make your voices heard about why it's problematic. I think people in general need to just exercise media literacy, and I can tell you newsrooms are very responsive to people giving their feedback. They notice how many page views they get. They notice who's engaging or what the feedback is, and just being very vocal when you see dehumanizing coverage, right? The other day, there was a horribly racist video by a right-wing think tank here in Washington called the Heritage Foundation, in which they use the most sensationalist, disgusting, dehumanizing language to talk about how the US cannot absorb or accept Palestinian refugees because they won't accept our way of life. There was enough outcry online on Twitter, I'm not going to call it X, that the Heritage Foundation was forced to take down that video. And I think people made it clear, listen, this kind of dehumanizing language is what leads to horrific incidents like the 6-year-old Palestinian Wadi' al-Fayoumi in Chicago, who was stabbed to death last week. So just being vocal, making your voices heard, supporting good journalism, being vocal about bad journalism, holding people to account. You all may have seen the viral video of the young Egyptian woman at the border, the Rafah border, who reamed out the CNN correspondent Clarissa Ward for dehumanizing coverage. And there's a reason that video went viral. She expressed the frustrations of so many people about the dehumanizing coverage of Palestinians.
I also like the fact that you're saying there's no substitute for real on-the-ground hard work. We all need to be mobilized and ready to respond to the negative story. I assume you would also encourage, particularly for those in America, but I think anyone in a Security Council country has a special responsibility to try to lobby their politicians. And this is part of the democratic process, writing to our congressperson or our MP. So on the lobbying question, actually, Sami, this, is, I'm going to direct this at you, but, Leila, if you want to respond to this, because you'll have plenty of experience with this. So we know that Mearsheimer and Walt wrote a famous book called The Israel Lobby, and someone's asking about the Israel Lobby. Why does the Israel Lobby possess such immense influence, and how can Muslims proactively adopt measures to also have their voice heard in the corridors of power?
I think that lobbying comes in various different ways and forms. I think that a powerful documentary can be made that forces policymakers to reverse their decision. That's lobbying. I think that when you see that the CNN presenter and the BBC presenter and then the Sky News presenter start apologizing for falling far short of journalistic standards with regards to the coverage of Palestine and Israel, that's also part of lobbying. That's as a result of that social media wave that took place, in which they had no choice other than to apologize. Think about it. They didn't apologize because Tel Aviv asked them. Tel Aviv was happy with the way they covered it. They didn't apologize because Biden or the White House asked them. They apologized solely because, as Leila was mentioning earlier, they were deeply concerned by the feedback that they got, which was overwhelmingly negative, and therefore they're trying to align themselves with the public opinion, and that's why it's more important than ever to express that public opinion. Public opinion has the ability, and it's part of lobbying power in and of itself. When people see those 300,000 people in London protesting, it makes MPs look up. It makes Keir Starmer 2 days ago say that I didn't say that Israel has the right to turn off electricity or the like, rolling back that statement. It forces the Labour Party to have an emergency meeting in the nighttime to be warned by Sue Gray, the chief of staff, that the Muslim bloc is really angry and they're going to start resigning and the councils will like, which makes David Lammy and the other MPs start to go to visit mosques to try to say to them, please, please, don't continue to vote for us. I'm here to visit you. It's what makes Justin Trudeau go to visit a mosque where he's booed. The reason they do that is because we do have lobbying power. I think that when we're trying to compare methodologies, I think that's the wrong way of doing it. I think it's more about trying to assess the options that are available to us in order to try to have influence. The reality is that we do have documentaries that are being made. Leila was talking about talking to Congress people themselves. That interaction stays in their minds. We've seen the interactions on social media that encourages us to go right to our MPs. Yesterday, I spoke at a hackathon where people are trying to create these apps. Somebody is creating an API which will encourage people to do an automated letter to send to the MPs to express their opposition and the like. There's a lot of creativity in terms of this lobbying power or the like. I also want to, the reason why I want to shift the question as well is because the question implies that there's no lobbying effort at the moment or that lobbying efforts are weak. I argue the lobbying efforts are strong, and the proof of that is that there is a shift in global public opinion. There are changes taking place as a result of the efforts. You think, for example, the viral videos that have gone on TikTok and social media are of Muhammad al-Kurd's the television appearances, Hussam Zumlot's appearances, Mustafa Barghouthi's spectacular interview with Fareed Zakaria. It's these eloquent Palestinians who speak fluent English, who no longer need an interlocutor, and that is surprising media channel to the extent where they're like, we're not sure this is the impact we want to have. You look at Piers Morgan, who only cares about views, who has no strong opinions. As soon as he saw that pro-Palestinian guests are getting him millions and millions of views, he's bringing one after the other, one after the other. And when you read the comments, you can see people saying, oh my goodness, I never saw that this was the case. I'm changing my opinion on what's happening with regards to Palestine and Israel. And that feeds into the constituencies, that feeds into the policymakers and the like. People think lobbying is about putting money in political campaigns or the like. It's not. It's exactly what Layla was saying and exactly what many other people are saying. It's about investing in the local community and empowering their stories and enabling them to be able to tell their stories and then collectively amplifying that stories. And this Palestine cause is the clearest example. The reason it's broken the algorithm is because all of us collectively are amplifying the voice of Palestinians by retweeting and sharing. We see a Palestinian voice, we retweet. We see Muhammad Al-Kurd, we retweet. We see Hussam Zomlot, we retweet. We are amplifying those voices. So we are showing that we have the capacity for lobbying. I think the issue is more about direction. An issue is more about convincing the people who should lend their support for lobbying that it's worth it. And I'll finish on this point. Notice the question on public opinion. That question reflects this defeatist mentality that is prevalent in many communities, that they don't have the power to do anything when in reality they do. It's about telling a community that they do have the power to do something. And when you convince the community they have the power, you suddenly see that the opportunities start being taken, and they're seeing the opportunities before them and they are taking it. And I think we're seeing changes take place.
Thank you very much. I wonder, and I'll come back to you, Sami, with this question, but I'll just put it to you at this point. I mean, to a certain extent, democracy is about very fine margins of difference. And so a block of 3 or 4% is usually a kingmaker in a democratic system. And, you know, should Muslims be thinking very seriously about the fact that with a population of around 6% in the UK or 2% in the US, which is, you know, the margin between candidates, they just need to recognize their own power and think about the long game in that way. That there's no need to be dispirited. You know, being dispirited is the talk of the devil, as it were. We have everything that we need. God has empowered us. So there is a broader question. This could actually be directed at both of you if you like. But Layla, you actually kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes some Muslim sort of scholars, I'll put that in kind of scare quotes, have seemed to wish to normalize with Israel, and others, perhaps not going quite so far, have argued that, you know, protesting is not you know, a useful use of one's time, or saying in some instances that it's against the Sunnah. Actually, this is perhaps Sami, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and Layla, if you'd like to add anything, please feel free. Is protesting not good?
I think that a lot of those arguments are very much politicized, in that there is a trend in the Arab world now that is trying to push towards normalization of ties with Israel. You'll note, for example, that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, when he spoke at the summit with the ASEAN countries, in a 5-minute speech, he dedicated exactly 32 seconds to the Palestinian issue. He called it violence instead of a conflict. He didn't mention Israel by name. He didn't condemn Israel either. He referred to the 1967 borders, and it looked like in those 32 seconds, he tried to appease the Muslim audience by talking about 1967 instead of what he was saying before about as long as their life is made easier. But at the same time, told the Israelis, I really don't want to get involved with this. I'm focused on Riyadh season and all the concepts and stuff that are coming with that. I don't want to focus on this particular issue. A lot of the idea of not protesting is about managing the public opinion and trying to contain the potency of public opinion. And I think that what a lot of scholars, between quotation marks, are uncomfortable with is that Islam in its very essence doesn't require an intercessor with Allah. So everybody has the capacity to be able to identify what is right and what is wrong. And the duty upon the Muslim is to act based on that. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi." He who sees something wrong, let him try to change it with his hand. And if he can't, let him denounce it with his tongue. And if he can't, let him condemn it in his heart. I think that when scholars come out to ban protests, I think it's less to do with whether protests actually work and much more to do with trying to maintain control over public opinion that threatens to spiral out of control and threatens to cause a seismic shift in a political situation that will lead to lasting change. And that generally regimes tend to be averse to change. And that's why I think that the reality is that when you look at the progress that's been made on the Palestinian cause, that amnesty, that it took them 70 years to finally call Israel an apartheid state, that it took Human Rights Watch 70 years to finally see Israel fought as an apartheid state, those changes didn't come because suddenly they woke up and they said, Allah, this is an apartheid state. It came because public opinion pressure and protest was so heavy and so consistent and so potent that in the end they tried to make a compromise in which they said it's an apartheid state, and even that is progress in and of itself. So when they say protests don't work, I think all objectivity with regards, if you apply objectivity to even the last 90 years and the fall of colonization, the fall of apartheid, the Arab Spring and the changes it brought, protest is what brings about change, not regimes which are trying to settle for the status quo.
I want to actually connect this to the next question as well. And so, Layla, perhaps you can address both of these. Again, both of you can respond to, this is a BDS question. So the BDS movement, people will know, is the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against Israeli apartheid. It says, how much of an impact do you think it can have, especially since so many sort of pro-Israeli companies operate in the Muslim world as well? Should we actually be trying to exert pressure on those fronts?
Well, we've seen in the South African context that it was very pivotal in helping achieve freedom and ending the apartheid state for Black South Africans. But we know that it wasn't the beginning of their struggle. And we know that it was only effective once the West started responding positively to it. And we also know that there have been tremendous resources devoted to completely suppressing the BDS movement, to criminalizing it in the United States. So you've had many states actually passing laws to criminalize BDS. And you see in the wider context of nonviolence as a strategy for Palestinians that it's been brutally suppressed. So we know that in 2018, the Palestinians in Gaza peacefully marched in what was called the Great March of Return, and 200 of them, including medic Razan al-Najjar, including journalist Yasser Murtaja, were brutally murdered. No one was held accountable for their killings. Again, Razan was a medic saving lives. Yasser was a photojournalist taking photos. So I think what we need to do is point out the hypocrisy of the West, which is what you're saying to Palestinians is there's no form of resistance to your ethnic cleansing, to your occupation, to the siege of Gaza, to the ongoing genocide. And that this is, the response to nonviolence resistance, whether it's the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, or the Great March of Return, is violent suppression or criminalization. And I think this is just something that people have to keep speaking about. They have to continue pushing for these nonviolent types of resistance in their own countries, and again, pointing out the hypocrisy of the West.
And I think we can take some comfort in the fact that it's eliciting such a hostile response indicates it works, right? So I think that's something for us all to take some, sorry, my words are I'm losing them for a moment, but inshallah, drive us forward. This is a question which is directed to the UK audience, but again, Layla, if you want to reflect on this, please feel free, but this is directed at Sami. From the UK, how best would the panelists advise that, young people, youth, respond to our politicians' dismissal of Palestinians' right to resist? I'll add to this the fact that demographically, the Muslim community globally is very young, and the most recent census indicated that 50% of the UK population, Muslim population, is under the age of 27. So we really have a responsibility to think about how young people are to respond to these sorts of challenges, because young people can also be a bit hot-headed. So we need to channel that. Sami, please, if you could share your reflections.
I think that I think the simple answer is let them know that it matters. Tell them it matters. Make them know without any doubt whatsoever that it matters. The reason why I say that is because the loudness with which we're talking about Palestine, especially in the UK, to be frank, is unprecedented. Before, we'd be worried about losing our jobs. We'd be worried about being isolated. We'd be worried about losing opportunities, about losing our training contracts with law firms, about being isolated from society or the like. But this time it's unprecedented. 2,000 British actors came out with a joint statement to say they're calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We're seeing politicians now rolling back on their initial unconditional support for Israel. We're seeing 300,000 people take to the streets in London. We're seeing Jeremy Corbyn, for example, unapologetically coming out and calling for a ceasefire. We're seeing more and more allies, more and more people talking. And the reason that's significant is because the more people who are talking, they are causing that global shift. When we talk about young people, what they can do, the first thing is they have done something. They are the ones who are sharing on social media and commenting. They have done something. They have forced the algorithm to favor pro-Palestinian content, and they have managed to bring about the change and shift. That is why Israel is scrambling and spending millions on adverts that pop up even on Muslim videos in order to try to convince the world that Israel is doing something that is something just versus animals who are the Palestinians. I think that when it comes to the young people and their representatives, I think it should be said representatives don't hear enough about how important Palestine is, because Muslims have always been uncomfortable about the consequences and repercussions of talking about Palestine, because they fear they'll be cornered on uncomfortable issues instead of talking directly about the issue of civilians, about occupation, about the right for freedom and dignity of the Palestinians. I think now we have a generation, now we have an environment where we can actually speak openly with our politicians, just as Justin Trudeau, they told him in the mosque, just as David Lammy and Yvette Cooper when they came to the mosque, to say to them, Palestine matters to us. You can't come to us on election day and say vote for us because the Tories are bad, when it turns out you're just as bad as the Tories. I saw somebody tweet and say that what's the difference now between Trump, who wants to ban Arabs from coming to the US, and Biden, who bombs them senseless and supports Israel bombing them in Gaza? I think that now people, or this generation, is, I don't want to say much braver because it implies the elders weren't brave, but certainly the goalposts have moved. The global shift now enables a greater volume through which we can use to talk about the Palestine issue. And now is the time to tell the representatives very loudly that just as the pro-Israel lobby are shouting at you and telling you to support Israel, we can shout just as loud at you as well and say that Palestine means something to us. And the reality is that we're seeing the shift in the statements and the like. So when it comes to young people, I know you mentioned that some of them are hot-headed or the like, but I think it's less about, you know, being very aggressive and more about, just as Ian Bremmer said on his Twitter when he said, I've never seen so much disinformation, i.e. I've never seen so much Palestinian content. It's about making that representative, just as much as he used to see the sanitized content that was facilitated by the Israelis, now he sees an equivalent, if not more, Palestine content. And that representative says to themselves, I want to win my seat in the next election. I should at least, you know, not keep all my eggs in one basket. I'll say Israel has the right to self-defense, but I'll say that, you know, Palestinians are an occupied people. And that in itself makes Israel upset. When the Israeli president Herzog tells Rishi Sunak in public, in front of the cameras, that we're upset with BBC coverage because they've refused to use certain terms that we want them to use, or we're upset, and we believe BBC coverage to be biased already, it means that the Israelis would not even tolerate even an inch of the global opinion being shifted, and they're already frustrated that statements are now being qualified. And even if representatives qualify the statement and that might not be to your satisfaction, it's a huge win. So the direct answer to your question is, let them know Palestine matters, because in the past we've often been too hesitant to let them know that it matters. Now the environment is conducive. Let's make our voices heard.
Leila, I want to give you the last word. I know you have a minute, but just to, from a Palestinian perspective, from the perspective of someone who, perhaps you can share an anecdote that gives you hope from what you've seen from perhaps through the grapevine of family about the future of Palestine as an Ummatic cause.
Well, this summer, as I mentioned, we went to Palestine, and at one point we went to Jenin, and we wanted to see for ourselves the destruction of the refugee camp. I should mention, just last night, the Israeli military bombed a mosque in Jenin. And so this, this town in the northern West Bank, this city has seen so much. It's where the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed. And we sort of were looking at the homes that were destroyed by the Israeli military, just as they had, destroyed so many were turned into rubble. They even destroyed some of the streets. So you see like entire roads just completely destroyed. It was even difficult to maneuver and get around. And we saw this older woman whose son had been killed by the military and whose two remaining children just looked completely shell-shocked. One of her sons was just sitting in this room in the dark. She told us that the Israeli soldiers had urinated on their mattresses. They had like just destroyed her home. And all she kept saying was, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. And I just could not believe that that was her reaction to so much loss, so much destruction, such a difficult life under occupation. If she can say Alhamdulillah, that gives you perspective of, the minuscule challenges in comparison that we go through. And I think the perseverance of the Palestinian people should give inspiration to all of us, that in the face of crushing, occupation, trauma, devastation, collective punishment, they can continue saying Alhamdulillah. And that gives me hope and, persistence.
Alhamdulillah. I think Alhamdulillah is the best point on which to conclude this wonderful session. Really want to thank you both. Thank you, Sister Layla. Thank you, Brother Sami. And of course to Dr. Ramzy for giving us really an insight that is difficult to sort of get quite so powerfully unless you're speaking to Palestinians or people who are, intimately involved in this historical injustice, seeking that justice, inshallah. And we as an ummah seek that justice. And I always see the Palestinian cause as a signal to the pulse of the ummah being quite healthy. The fact that the ummah around the world is so alive right now while this ongoing bombardment, unjust and brutal bombardment, is taking place against our brothers and sisters, is a reminder that actually, even in moments of darkness, we are reminded of the strength of the ummah and the spirit of the ummah and the love of the ummah. For as the hadith says, as the hadith says, the Prophet ﷺ said that the ummah is one body. When one part of it is unwell, the rest of the body stays awake at night with fever. And we feel that pain. We're all Palestinian, really. And Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, for attending. We've had nearly 200 people in attendance for the last 2 hours. And once again, thank you so much, Layla. And Sami seems to have had to depart a bit early. But thank you so much for both of your contributions, and to Dr. Ramzy. And I conclude with Alhamdulillahi awalan wa akhira. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.